All right, Pastor has asked to open up this class, so I'm going to go ahead and let him start, and then we'll pick it up from there.
All right, I want to quickly do two things, and then I said I would keep it brief, turn it back over to Eric, and we'll say more about this, certainly because we don't have everyone here that I would want to hear this, but I want to do two things. I want to, first of all, plug the classes, the lectures that Eric's been doing and recording outside of the class he's doing here. If you've watched those or he's mentioned these in class, he's done a few of these kind of midweek lessons. And a couple so far, he covered, in one of those, he covered the Amplified Bible. He covered the NASB 20 and LSB. And then he covered this last week, the NLT, the New Living Translation. And I've listened to all those. I just want to give a plug for that. It's awkward for him to plug his own material, but really want to encourage, if you get a chance, this, in my mind, these lectures we're in right now, these lessons, are kind of the culmination. They're why we've done all the other work. So we can get here and go, so why do we have a boatload, a bookshelf full of translations? And what are these? And so a couple things real quick. Really the practical application aspect, when I encourage with this, I've found it really helps understand and appreciate the variety of translations. I think, and I understand this, and rightly so, we have probably a healthy caution and care as we see kind of the proliferation of translations. And there's a part of me that at times has been like, not another one. But this has been really helpful and really good reminder for a number of reasons in that way. And so just want to encourage that way. And I'll say this, if it's helpful, you can speed up the playback of the video on YouTube. So you go to the YouTube, I play it on 1.5. Eric talks a lot faster on 1.5. You kind of have to hang in there, and it sounds a little funny, no offense, but 1.5 works pretty well. So you can do that, speed it up a little bit, and zip through them a little faster if you want. But really helpful to have those available. And then I want to say this, looking ahead, January 4th, we're going to be starting a new series in Sunday school. Two classes we're going to be offering. One will be a class in stewardship, Christian stewardship of finances, time, health, the gospel. I forget all the categories. Carl Johnson will be leading that primarily. We may have one or two others that help teach some of those classes, but looking forward to that. And then we're going to also run a class simultaneously for new members, those interested in joining the church. So welcome class. And these will be 12-week classes, so a quarter in length. And the new member class is going to be 6 weeks looking at kind of a welcome to our church, who we are, what we're doing, and then 6 weeks of a series called Following Jesus, really just kind of a basics for growth in Christ and how do I walk with the Lord. And so hopefully it'll be a good encouragement that way. But that will start January 4th, and we'll get more word out about that, but wanted to mention that this morning. Eric.
All right, so I will agree with Pastor that you definitely can speed me up on YouTube. I've finally gotten over my own angst of listening to myself online. And so now I do, to hear all the stupid things I said and the typos where I called the wrong translation the wrong thing, or I named the wrong person occasionally. Thankfully, it's not, I pick up on it. I don't know how often you guys pick up on it, but and then that's also, I speed myself up. I'm usually at 1.5 as well, or 2. But yes, I don't talk that fast in class, but you're more than welcome to listen to me at that speed. All right, so let's see where we picked up. All right, so like Pastor said, I was going to mention it in my review. Let's see. Oh, you know what? I forgot to turn this on. Let's turn this on. There we go. All right, so we mentioned this in the review. Last time we were together, we talked about the NASB 77 and 95 and the 71 because that was its inception. And then in the midweek class, we talked about the NASB 20 and the LSB. And then we did 2 midweek classes this week. So we also talked about the Living Bible as the precursor to the NLT and how that paved the way for some less formal translations because that was all that was available at that time. And so the next, where I kind of ended was, do translations have to be a revision of a previous work? Because as we can see here, that's all we've been doing. We've been revising. And so the next question is is that how we have to do it? Do we have to just revise? And so the answer is no. And so what do we call it if we don't do a revision? And this was something I racked my head over. There's no accepted term for a translation that doesn't rely on the work of a previous translation. But many words have been used to describe this process. And so I racked my brain for a while trying to come up with a term that best describes this process where we're just going to start from scratch. And so Wycliffe did what I would call an ad fontes translation. Ad fontes is just Latin for back to the sources, okay? Now, to be fair, ad fontes meant back to the sources like Greek and Hebrew in the classical works. I'm using it as in we're just not revising anything. We're just starting fresh in the translation. So an ad fontes translation versus an ad fontes Greek or Hebrew text, okay? Which is how the term was originally used. So Tyndale also did an ad fontes translation. He didn't use Wycliffe or any earlier Greek version. He just started fresh from scratch. And so yeah, so here's the thing. There's no acceptable term, but in my reading, okay, so this term, people describe this process all the time, and they have their own words that they've used for it. In my reading, there was many people who described this kind of work. Some of them described it as a fresh translation. It's new. It's not carrying old translations with it, okay? Some said a virgin translation. That was a one I came across multiple times. It's a pure translation in the sense that it has no influence on it apart from being, no influence on it from a translation that was previous. They're just going right to the Greek and Hebrew. An independent translation, meaning it was independent of any other translation work. And then another one was a de novo translation. De novo is just Latin for meaning back to the beginning or to the beginning or from the beginning. And it starts beginning the process and creates a translation instead of picking a translation to work from, they're just starting from scratch. So I will tell you, I spent an unjustified amount of time trying to settle myself on picking which term to use for this class. Like literally, I probably spent a week and a half on this, really just weighing it and digging in and doing all sorts of stuff that just is so unnecessary. I could have just picked one. But I'll just tell you, I didn't want to use a fresh translation because I didn't like the idea of it being understood as adding something new to the Bible, as though it wasn't traditional or something of that nature, that it was fresh. I didn't want to use virgin because I didn't want to use that, come off as awkward and repeat that word over and over and over and give the impression that a virgin translation is pure while a revision has been corrupted in some sort of way. And I didn't want to give that impression. I didn't like the idea of independent because I didn't want it to be confused with a translation that was done by a single person versus a committee. So I didn't want to call it an independent translation. I really liked de novo. That was the term I had originally settled on, and I wrote all my slides and wrote de novo in all of these where you see ad fontes as italicized up there. It was originally de novo. And I was going to just introduce that term, teach it, and carry on. But then I realized that the term that really carried the meaning that we had and already has some Christian history behind it was ad fontes, back to the sources. And so I thought this is a really good way to just describe this process where they're just going to take the Greek and Hebrew and they're going to go back to the sources. They're not going to revise. And so what is an ad fontes translation? It's just a translation that doesn't rely on the work of any previous translation, but instead starts from scratch. Okay? So if at any point during this section, because I have pondered these terms far too often, if I say virgin translation, fresh translation, or de novo translation, just understand I'm talking about this. I'm talking about a translation that has been started from scratch. So really up to this point in our class, there really hasn't been a popular English Bible translation that has been an ad fontes translation, pretty much right from Tyndale. Tyndale was the last one we talked about. Right from Tyndale, everybody has been revising his work to some extent. And we've been revising Tyndale's work all the way through up until what we're going to talk about today. So clearly, revisions have been the preferred method of creating a new translation, whether it was in the Reformation era or even in the modern era. But I wanted to ask the question, why is a revision preferred over an ad fontes translation? And really, the bottom line is it comes down to mostly economics. It is significantly faster and generally less expensive to revise a previous work than to start from scratch. Right? That makes perfect sense. Someone else has already done the work. It's a relatively good work. It's a good work that's not perfect, so it can be improved upon. So we don't have to do a ton to it to make it better. So we're just going to revise it. It's cheaper and it's generally faster. Generally, okay? There's always exceptions where people take their sweet time to do things, and that's okay too. Some revisions do take a long time. Per example, the KJV took 11 years. So, or 7 years, not 11, 7 years to do the KJV. That's a long time. But on the flip side, we saw with the LSB, it took less than 2 years. So there's your two extremes, something of that nature. All right. So the other one, more easily received, generally retains a traditional feel, right? So because it's something you're already familiar with, revising it is easier to receive because you're familiar with it, generally speaking. So churches and people will generally be quicker to adopt a revision than something fresh, if you will. Lastly, because you are not reinventing the wheel, as it were, you are less likely to introduce brand new errors with a revision, right? What you will probably do, maybe, the whole point of you revising it is because you've caught some errors, but you might retain some old errors. So you'll keep the old errors, but the chances of you introducing brand new errors are going to be lower. Not impossible. All you have to do is go back to the RSV and see if you're introducing new errors based on how people were viewing that translation. I actually don't think that one was a new error. It was just a different, it was a different way of translating it. I think it was still legitimate. All right. All right. So what are the benefits to doing an ad fontes translation? One, starting from scratch with the latest scholarship in mind, you're going to scrutinize every single detail. All right. You're going to do what Tyndale did. You're going to go paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, word for word, trying to figure out what's the best. And so you're going to have the latest in mind with textual criticism. You'll have the latest in mind with linguistics. You'll have the latest in mind across the board. So you're not carrying some old things with you. You're going to be able to stay current. That's one of the benefits. It's not tied to it's the way it's always been done, or if it's not broke, don't fix it philosophy, right? So if you've ever done any kind of work on crafting something, sometimes you keep modifying and modifying and modifying and adding and removing, and eventually you end up with this Frankenstein work. And it works, and it does the job, and it does it well, but it's ugly. Right? And so it's not efficient, but it works. And if you just took the time to tear it apart and start over knowing everything you know now, you could make something more beautiful and more efficient. And this can apply to translations as well. In that instead of working around the syntax and sentence structures, I can rewrite it in a smoother, more contemporary way. Instead of deciding if a word is contemporary, and good enough to retain, I can just use the word that is on the uppermost sense of people's mind. You're not necessarily bogged down by this is the way it's always been done, and there is possibly a better or clearer way to say it. Of course, that means you are also more likely to get rid of embedded old errors by doing this, and by that same token, you are more likely to introduce a new error. Okay, this happens, and that's okay. And so to be clear, every revision is eventually going to be traced back to the ad fontes. They're always going to go back to the Greek and Hebrew. Even the revisions are. They're not just updating the English. They're updating based on what they understand from Greek and Hebrew as well. And revisions aren't exempt from making new mistakes. They can. And that doesn't mean ad fontes translations are going to make new mistakes. It just the likelihood, the probability raises. And So I want to say, maybe I'll say it after. Let's finish. Let's do the third one. And you can set up new rules and guidelines that will be more consistently held across the translation instead of adding your rules on top of the rules that existed prior to you, right? So every translation they go through and they say, hey, this is what we want to accomplish. But the translation team before you didn't necessarily have those goals in mind. And so you're adding goals on goals on goals on goals. With that, or fresh translation, ad fontes translation, you can just be more consistent because you're not relying on the work of people before you. Bottom line, there are pros and cons to both using revisions and ad fontes translations. And so I think it's good for you to be aware of the fact that these exist. And when you're referencing your Bibles, to reference ad fontes and revisions. This is a good practice to do. All right. And that picks us up with our next story. This story, The Spark of Something New, is what I titled this. This story goes, again, we're going back. We're going backwards to 1955 now. So what's happening in 1955? Well, we have Kenneth Taylor that we just talked about. We have the RSV just being released. And now we're introducing a new man by the name of Howard Long. So the RSV has just been released, and it's taking heat from conservative evangelical scholars. Okay, and we talked about this. We've already covered that. The King James Version was still king. All right, everyone that has a Bible probably has a KJV. All right, it's not gone out of the wayside. Everyone's using it. The ASV, 1901, remember, so we're 50 years later, is declining in sales now because of new discoveries, later scholarship, and it didn't have that traditional base that the KJV had, that trusted long-term longevity that the KJV had, so the KJV is still number one. Our story takes place with this man from Seattle by the name of Howard Long. He was an engineer, and he was a businessman from GE. He was not a pastor, nor was he a scholar. More importantly, what he was a man who loved God and loved to share the gospel with those around him. His work for GE caused him to travel all around the country regularly. And so because of that, he took the Great Commission seriously. And everywhere he went, his number one goal was not to work for GE, but was to spread the gospel. GE was his way of traveling around the country to do this work. All right. He did a good job for GE, but the gospel was always first and foremost on his mind. So Howard recounts a particular experience where he was meeting with an associate from GE to discuss the latest projects at the Multnomah Hotel in Portland, Oregon. Howard had an additional agenda, though. He was not just going to talk about the latest projects that GE was working for. Howard was not going to let this opportunity slip. He was going to share the gospel with this man. And the opportunity rose in the conversation. And as it is with Howard Long, the conversation turned to spiritual matters. And the associate admitted that he really didn't know much about God. We're talking 1955 here. Sometimes I think that only happened recently, that everybody knew about God in the 1950s. But that was not the case here. The man said he didn't know much about God, but that he was curious. And so over dinner, Howard attempted to share the gospel with this man out of his trusty KJV. The verses he shared with the associate struck. They landed. The man turned red. And Long thought, oh man, I've offended him. I'm about to get yelled at. And something different happened. The man began to burst out in chuckling. He's like, that is the funniest thing I have ever heard in a long time. The language is so weird and archaic. Why does it sound like that? So these sacred, life-changing verses that were precious to Howard were near hilarious to his associate. This interaction, among others, this wasn't the only one of its kind, but it was unique in this way that the man found it funny, really frustrated Long and caused him to seek a reliable English Bible in contemporary English. And Howard Long went back to his church. His church was the Christian Reformed Church led by Pastor Peter DeYoung, not to be confused with Kevin DeYoung. Pastor Peter DeYoung. And his quote to his pastor, as we understand it, he says, "We translated the Bible into hundreds, thousands of tongues. And when we run out of tongues to translate it into, someday we are going to translate it into English." I love this quote so much, but this was his heart. His heart was to share the gospel clearly from the Bible in contemporary, common, vernacular English. And his heart became his pastor's heart. And so the Christian Reformed Church has an annual meeting every year. And so they have a local meeting, which Pastor Peter DeYoung is the president of that local meeting. We're going to get into some church polity here, which is going to, you'll understand some things, so I'm going to try to break it down for you. But basically, the polity works like this for the Christian Reformed Church, is that they have a, let me see, I think I have it on the next slide. They have a local assembly. I'm going to get into the technical terms. They have a local assembly. The local assembly is like this, a local church, right? And the pastor is the pastor and the president of that local assembly. Then they have a regional assembly, and then they have a national assembly. And to get anything done denominational wide in this in this sect, they have to get it up to the national level and get it approved, and then it will impact everyone in this denomination. So Peter DeYoung submitted a resolution for his regional assembly to consider. And it would have to be approved by the regional assembly before it could be approved by the national assembly, which would then move the resolution forward, okay? And so here's the transcription. The transcription is of the image is a portion of the Acts of the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church detailing the start of this project, okay? So what is it? Resolution 27 is the one he put in there, and he said the Consistory of Seattle Christian Reformed Church Overture Synod, okay? So those are all of your technical terms there. Consistory is what he's a part of. Then he's got the regional, and then the national is the synod, okay? So those are your technical terms, all right? Endeavor to join with other conservative churches in sponsoring and facilitating the early production of a faithful translation of the scriptures in the common language of the American people. Grounds for this. 1, we do not have such a translation. We do not now have such a translation. A, versions presently used among us, the King James and the American Standard Versions, have become antiquated so that they are no longer written in the common language of the people. B, the Revised Standard Version, presumably written to fill this need for a modern translation, has failed to win the approval of our synod and other conservative Christians. 2, such a version is needed, A, to make our own use of God's word less difficult and therefore more effective. B, to make the word of God easier for our children to understand. C, to make the word more readily accessible to those unfamiliar with it as they are confronted with it in missionary and personal work. And then 3, our Reformed faith, which is founded on God's word, demands that we use every available, appropriate means to produce the use and study of that word. Respectfully submitted, the Consistory of Seattle Christian Reformed Church, Peter DeYoung, President, and Jacob Enfield, Clerk. And so like I said, there are 3 levels. So you have the Consistory, which is the local level, the classis, that's the word I couldn't find. The classis is the regional level, and then the synod is the national level. So he is the president of the local. He's appealing to the classis. If the classis approves it, it will go to the synod, the national one. Hopefully you're following, okay? Here's what happened. The classis said no. The regional level said no, not interested in this project. Okay. But this didn't stop Pastor DeYoung. He was going to continue to pursue this, and he was going to use his church polity to do so. And so in his church polity, he can appeal to the synod. He can bypass the classis and go right to the synod for this, and that's what he decides to do. So the synod heard the resolution and the ensuing discussion and ultimately decided not to vote on it. And instead, they said they wanted to defer this for further investigation. So the synod opted to leave this to the professors of the Old and New Testament of their seminary, which is Calvin Seminary, to research the resolution further and report back the following year. So they're going to say, is the information that's found in this resolution, is it true? Is this something we should be doing? They're going to leave it to these professors. These professors are 4 men at Calvin Seminary. These 4 men are going to be Henry Schultz, Ralph Staub, Martin Weingarten, and Martin Woodstra. Hopefully I didn't butcher their names too bad. Those 4 men are going to do this investigation over the next year. Okay. 1 year passed, and those 4 men gave their report. Long story short, they agreed with the resolution and advised the synod to approve it. Now, just so you know, the synod itself has an advisory committee. And the advisory committee hears all of the resolutions before it goes to the synod. And if the advisory committee doesn't approve it, it doesn't go to the synod. I'm just going to say for a moment here that this is probably one of the reasons that I like being an independent church, because we can just move a little bit more quicker. But at the same time, I heard someone say something this past week. I think it was actually Mark Ward who said it. And I just thought it was really powerful the way he said it. Sometimes things that move at glacial speed also move with the power of a glacier. And so that when it is done, it is a powerful force. And so there's that effect as well. So the advisory committee heard the heard the arguments of the 4 men, the result of their research, and the advisory committee decided not to approve the suggestion by these 4 men to approve the resolution. They argued that the 4 men did not successfully argue the urgent necessity for a new translation, nor had they demonstrated that there were a sufficient number of conservative churches interested in the project. And as I was doing this reminded me exactly of what I went through when I was trying to get my previous church to update the KJV. Those were the exact same 2 objections they gave to me. There's no urgent need for this, and there's not enough of us that want this project to be done. And so I was like, wow, this is nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. So yeah, uncanny similarities. But I also thought to myself as I was working through this, because we're a couple years in at this point by the time this happens, and I'm thinking to myself, what's going on with Howard Long? Howard Long is still this man. This started with him, with his passion. And I could probably see his frustration as he's seeing all of this red tape and so on and so forth, going through this red tape and bureaucracy from the LST is what reminds me of this, what's happening right now. And the denomination refusing to take his concerns seriously and his pastor seriously. I think it must have been a trial for him, and I do very much appreciate his pastor's efforts to take this to its very end, despite the fact that his denomination are refusing to support his desire here. But Howard reportedly told the CRC Advisory Committee that it would take a few $1 million to complete this project, but that this wasn't something he was worried about. He said something to the effect of, what does the church need more? $100,000 pipe organs or an English Bible in the language of the common people? But alas, for the 3rd time, the request for a conservative vernacular English translation had seemingly been put to death. But God had other plans. One of the men at this meeting was named John Steck. John Steck spoke up in objection to the rejection of the resolution by the Synod Advisory Committee. He brought up their own points back to them. He said, if the 4 men failed to demonstrate that there was enough conservative interfaith churches interested in doing this project, shouldn't they at least wait until they have that data? So it wasn't the fact that the data came back as in that they weren't interested. He just didn't come back with the data that there were churches that were interested. It just was a blank space on the field, if you will. So he said, before we reject this, let's get that data. Let's find out if there are churches who are interested in doing this church interfaith. So not just within our denomination, but ecumenically, other conservative Christian churches. Through that discussion, John Steck was able to prevent the advisory committee from shutting down the project altogether, and instead, they gave another year to determine if there was sufficient interest in such a project. Another year-long delay to see if there was indeed interfaith support for such a project. The responses came pouring in. Churches from all over were, in fact, interested in this project happening. So finally now, in 1958, the Synod finally approved that this project could begin. And those 4 men who were originally entrusted to do the research on the project were now given the responsibility to oversee the project. This was all new for these 4 men. Admittedly, they were a bit over their heads and they were looking for help. So back to when the CRC was doing their research to find out if other churches outside the denomination would be interested in this project, another foundation got one of those letters. The National Association of Evangelicals, which represented dozens of conservative Christian denominations, thought this was such a good idea that they decided to form a committee of their own to pursue the work. Okay? So in 1961, so now we're at 1961 now, just keep track. This is a very long process. In 1961, the Christian Reformed Church reached out to the NAE, and they met together to talk about their goals for the project. The CRC had already been doing research for this project for many years. So at this point, so they were significantly ahead of the NAE as far as how to move forward, but the NAE had more resources at their disposal. So together, they would move this project forward as a joint effort. All right. In late 1962, a year later, after they had met and they had discussed on how we're going to move forward, so on and so forth, it would become clear that they needed more specialized help than what these committees had. And they were going to need leading evangelical scholars, and they were going to need financial help. Those were going to be the primary points. We need good credentialed men, and we need help financially. And so they would host a Bible conference to see if they could get both financial help and people willing to do this project. So in 1965, we're 10 years now from when Howard Long brought his concern to his pastor. 1965, Howard Long is burning in his heart so that he couldn't keep silent. He had to tell his pastor and for this contemporary English translation, and that would lead to this Bible conference that takes place at Trinity Christian College. This conference takes place for 2 days. The meeting that those attended were the meeting wanted those who were attended to respond to 2 questions. Okay, question number 1: is there truly a need for a modern English version of the Bible? And question number 2: if so, what should be done about it by the broader evangelical community? The conference reached a consensus that if these denominations were all going to work together on this project, and if they were all going to endorse this project, that the project needed to be for all English-speaking people, not just Americans. Now, you have to understand the timing about this, because there's a specific reason this committee is going to make this decision. We are in 1965 at this point, and at this point in history, Lockman is in the middle of their translation work. And they had already released portions of the New Testament and Psalms. And what is Lockman's project? The New American Standard Bible. So this committee says they got their focus on Americans. We want our focus to be beyond Americans. We want this to be for all English-speaking people. They didn't just want to duplicate the effort. They wanted to go beyond that of what Lockman was doing. And they needed to be a Bible that was for all English-speaking people everywhere. They wanted to be sufficient for liturgical and personal use. That was another goal of theirs. They wanted it to be sufficient for personal and liturgical use. Old words weren't going to do. The ASV was far too literal and not at all in vernacular English. The KJV, while less literal, was even less contemporary English. And so these were the problems. The RSV was not widely received, and this conservative conference felt it was too liberal in its approach to translation. No revision would do. No revision would do. This would need to come from scratch. They were going to start from the beginning. This conference of about 80 men of various denominations for this purpose approved the following resolution. English version faithful to the text of the scriptures, number 11. During the business meeting, the conference adopted the following statement. It is the sense of this assembly that the preparation of a contemporary English translation of the Bible should be undertaken as a collegiate endeavor for evangelical scholars. It was decided that the continuing committee of 15 men to be established to implement the work of the conference. This committee was to be constituted by an appointment committee made up of Burton Galder and so on and so forth. But the name I want you to, I'm not going to go through all their names, but the name I do want you to pick up on is John H. Steck. John H. Steck was the man who prevented this from being rejected earlier in the process. And now he's on the Committee of Bible Translation, also known as the CBT. So the CBT is going to be the committee that appoints the translation committee. Committees on committees on committees on committees. But the CBT is going to be an independent governing committee. All right. And so this was just the beginning. We're over 10 years now, past what Howard Long had asked for. But now we're finally in the beginning. The project is underway. And the project would become the new international version. This is where we're going, something new. This would mark the beginning of the NIV. The Committee for Bible Translations would select 100 original language scholars to do this work. By far, the largest translation committee anyone had had up to this point. The NLT will have 90 on their team, but they're not coming around until 1996. All right, so we're in the 1960s. So this is a lot for this early on. And it became apparent that when you take 100 original language scholars and you ask them to do this kind of work, and they all have full-time jobs, and they're going to have to step back from these full-time jobs in order to do this work that they believe in, this project is going to get expensive fast. And the New York Bible Society, so New York Bible Society is going to continue to be the New York Bible Society for decades. But today, the New York Bible Society is Biblica. So I'm going to refer to them primarily as Biblica moving forward. The New York Bible Society had a mission of getting the Bible translated into every language. Representatives were there at that conference, that conference in Trinity College. They realized that there was a language they had overlooked. They're trying to get the Bible into every language, and the language they had overlooked was English. They realized that the English language needed a contemporary English translation. 1968, 3 years into the project, the New York Bible Society, which would become Biblica, offered to finance the whole project. The estimation at this point was $850,000. And the CBT would remain in control of the text, but Biblica would hold the copyright in return. So they'll finance it. They'd have the copyright. CBT says, the words are ours. The copyright is yours. And they agreed. So the project continued. But in 1975, Biblica would be almost out of money. So we're 10 years into this project. The American economy was in trouble with double digits inflation. The project had reached a whopping $1.26 million, and the project wasn't done. There was a significant portion of the Old Testament left. The New Testament had been done. Biblica had reduced its own staff to keep the project funded. They had an endowment, they drained it. They had a beautiful historical building in New York, they sold it. They moved to New Jersey into a small, humble building. The board members took out second mortgages on their home. They all got loans from banks. They put their entire lives on the line to keep this project from failing. I'm blown away by this, the amount of sacrifice that goes into this. Then they went to fundraising. They were still coming out of money. They went to fundraising, and the 450 Club was started. The hope was to find 450 people willing to provide $250 every year for the next 4 years to fund the project. Only 30 people responded. It felt like that spark, that flame was going to go back out again. The New Testament was done. The next measure, they were going to cancel the Old Testament. They were just going to stop the project. But God had other plans. Zondervan had already worked with Lockman on the Amplified Bible and already reaped some financial benefits from that. They had also worked with Biblica on the publishing of the New Testament. So the New Testament was done, and they had released the New Testament to garner sales from that so they could continue the work. And so Biblica and the CBT went to Zondervan to ask them, in their hour of need, would they consider funding the rest of the project? Zondervan bankrolled the rest of the project and put their own company at risk doing it. They went through the same, they drained everything to get this project finished. But they believed in the project. And in return, they would receive exclusive publishing rights to the NIV. So Biblica is going to own the copyright. Zondervan is going to own the publishing rights, and the CBT is going to own the text. So this joint effort would allow the NIV to be completed in 1978. Zondervan would put out the first run. The first run would be 1 million copies. They sold out before they even finished printing them. The NIV was readily received. People were eager for a translation in the common English. The NIV would receive a minor update in 1984, and this would be the edition that would become the #1 selling Bible for decades. So the NIV would enter the market after the Living Bible. Remember, the Living Bible was a paraphrased Bible, but it paved the way for such a project to be a more functional translation instead of a formal one, which all had been released at that point. The NIV would be the first ad fontes translation we talk about in the series, but it won't be the last. Now, the motivating goal for Biblica is God's word for everyone, everywhere. Now, up to this point in our history, the NIV is truly the easiest translation to read up to this point. And it's not a paraphrase like the Living Bible was. So there was really nothing on par with the NIV. Nearly every church, so many churches, start adopting this translation. Now, the NIV generally today is considered a reading level of about 6th to 7th grade, depending on how you weigh reading levels, okay? The methodologies. There's a lot of misinformation out there about this subject, but I don't have time for that. We can get into that maybe in another class. Needless to say, the NIV being at about 6th or 7th grade reading level, Biblica saw a gap in a target audience for English translation. 3 audiences specifically they had in mind. English is the lingua franca, the common language of the world today, meaning more of the world knows English than every other language. However, the majority of the world does not know English as their native tongue, but as their second language. So when Biblica set out to create the NIV for all English-speaking people everywhere, they primarily had native English speakers in mind. So America, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Caribbean, etc., etc. Okay, then you have countries like India and South Africa, whose national official language is English, but not the native language of the people. And so all of these places, they have their own dialects and idioms and ways of speaking. So I'm going to be honest, this is a lofty goal for Biblica to write a singular English translation for all of these dialects. And so I honestly think that creates a weakness in it, but we'll cover that later. But what about everyone else? What about the Chinese, the Russians, the Middle East, where they know English, but they know it as a second language? Well, there are 4 categories which people know a second language. Or know a language. One is your mother tongue. Your mother tongue is the language you grew up in, you know it, you're an expert in your language as far as communication is concerned. 2 is fluent, where it's your second language, but you can communicate complex ideas in a second language. It's as if though you know it very well. You can communicate complex and fast. You probably think in that language. 3rd, conversational. It's the ability to have a full-on conversation, but not necessarily able to get into the complexities of it. You can have a conversation. And then 4th is basic comprehension. This is the ability to understand simple or basic concepts in one language. A full-on conversation is very difficult and clumsy for this group of people. You know enough English to survive. In other words, you can find the bathroom, you can ask for food, you can do the basics, okay? But full-on back-and-forth conversation is going to be difficult for this group of people. The majority of the world that uses English as a second language is somewhere between basic comprehension and, which is you know enough to survive, and conversational. It's somewhere between there. They do not follow the basic grammar rules. They generally do not understand cultural idioms. Conversations can happen as long as you keep the vocabulary simple and the sentence length short. Okay, if you've dealt with people who are using English as a second language, you've come across this. Since the majority of the people who speak English as their second language and they don't already have all of this background, they had the Biblica had the international English in mind. So it made perfect sense for them to consider these groups of people who may not have a Bible in their native tongue, but they can read an English Bible even if they can't read it well. Okay? Now, some members of the NIV with new translators started another project with 3 groups of English speakers in mind. ESL, English Second Language People, which we just covered. 2, children with 3rd grade reading level, okay? 3rd grade reading level with limited vocabulary and limited reading comprehension. And 3, people with learning disabilities who would have learning disabilities that might limit them to a 3rd grade education, okay? With these 3 categories in mind, they started a project in 1992, and it took them 4 years to create the NIrV, which is such a blessing for these people. Keep in mind that NIrV is not a replacement for the NIV, it's a complement. It's a complementary translation. This is similar in ways to how the NASB family worked if you watched that earlier midweek lesson. This would be the same for the NIV. The NIrV has been adopted by many churches specifically for their children's ministry, and I think this is a massive blessing for those churches to have this sort of resource. And so I also thank God for these translators and the vision of Biblica to get God's word out for everyone, everywhere. Next week, the NIV story is not over. It's just beginning. And we have a lot to cover. And so we're going to come back next week and we're going to talk about what happens with the NIV. There's a significant amount of controversy that is raised during this time period over gender language. The NIV is not going to be at the center of this controversy, but it's going to be impacted by it severely. And so next week, we're going to talk about that situation and what comes out of that, because multiple translations are going to come out of that situation. So we're going to pick up in the middle of the NIV story, but we have to pick up a different translation in order to do it. We'll pick up next week. You all are dismissed. Thank you.